Yeah, it's really interesting. And I think, you said when you came into MasterCard, you said, give me the tough one. What's the one that nobody else wants to tackle? So obviously tech services. I'm assuming that was what you were referring to in terms of that area. Um, you mentioned, the way that suppliers engage typically, if it's when you came in, there was no real cadence to it. And you have obviously taken a very methodical approach. And I hear that I hear similar kind of sentiments from people across the procurement world when they're talking about how sometimes it's difficult to get procurement professionals to stick with service-based categories, particularly technical kind of services, where there are other categories that are easier. So it's not for everybody, and it's a more thorny problem to solve. But I think it kind of, to a certain extent, ties into what I was saying to you before we started recording around how I always see services procurement as the biggest thing in procurement that kind of isn't really a thing. Um, and it all depends how you look at the procurement world and break it down. But with regards to the categories that you were addressing around tech services, um, what is it about them that you think makes them particularly challenging?
Well, I think it's the word, first of all, when you say tech services, because anything that you do from an IT perspective that involves labor, whether it's touching your code or not touching your code, whether it's supporting your live applications from a business applications or from an infrastructure standpoint, all can encompass that. And so first of all, when people talk about tech services inside MasterCard, I always delineate it in terms of touching code in our environment. So anybody that's touching code in our environment, anybody that is supporting live applications, whether it's business operations or it's technology infrastructure, or it's supporting the work around software development. So what we call TPMs, technical program management, PMTs, product management, technical. It's those roles that support that software development, but they're not necessarily touching the code as well. So that delineation helps them to have that focus around how you drive that optimization. And I always say tech services is the doing component, not the thinking component. Because when you talk about services, you also have a delineation around consulting, thinking, and doing, which is actual kind of keeping the lights on. It's progressing the company by actually doing activities that are then ultimately revenue generating, not just the thinking activities. So that's an element that anybody that has that role, you have to clearly delineate. Otherwise, you get pulled in so many different components that are, quote, under tech services.
Yeah, and I think when you look at the procurement of services in general, I always regard it as the basically the extended capacity and capability of that organization to be able to get things done. And, there's intellectual property, like you're talking about consulting and things like that, and there's effort and expertise that goes into it. And ultimately, I know you manage contingent workforce categories and things like that as well. There are different ways to get work done. You've got your teams, your permanent employees. You've got contingent workforce contractors, temps. There's all kinds of clever ways to utilize people on other time-based mechanisms, gig workers and things like that. And then you've got outsourcing, to a supplier to deliver on an output or deliverable basis. But it's all about the organization being able to function effectively, get what it needs to do done, be competitive in the market, give its clients a great service, and all that sort of thing. So I think sometimes people can kind of lose sight of that in a sense. And that's kind of it brings me back round to the data side of it, which I remember chatting to a CEO once and him saying to me, Johnny, the most important thing, or one of the biggest questions I want answered on a day-to-day basis, I need to know what's the most effective use of our resources. And that is all resources, all of the capacity and capability of that organization. And when you look at the services supply chain, particularly in a tech industry like you're in yourself, where finance, tech, the use of external service providers, and that expertise, that IP, that capacity is critical. And I always think to myself that it's the complexity of it that can lead to the lack of data, but it's also the nature of services. As you said before, you get lots of change requests because things are kind of buried in the SOW, but it's quite difficult for people to define the requirements as effectively in the first place. But ultimately, if they're not digitally captured, if they're just in a document, then that's never going to transition down the line as the service is delivered. Um, I've gone off on a bit of a rant there, but I do think that is a fundamental problem with this area. I don't know whether you'd agree.
Yeah, I totally agree, Johnny. So I think if I had to do this again, because we all should reflect on kind of how we do things and how we could do things better, I think what I would have done more effectively upfront is clearly defining the delineation between time and material and deliverable-based engagements.
Right.
Because I was just like everyone else in procurement when I came in. I was naive when I took services on, and I was thinking, oh, we need to be able to drive more accountability and responsibility on the supplier. We need to have more deliverable-based engagements. And how do we build the maturity around the business so that we can drive more of that, right? I was naive to think that. But if I had to do this again, I think I would probably have tried to build what is the pillars of how we define deliverable based versus time and material. Because you mentioned a lot of key things there that to me are all different components of what makes up your overall category strategy, right? If I can, I'll summarize a few of the things that you shared, and then I'll talk about these four components that make up a deliverable based. So, first thing is, I just talked about like tech services and what is tech services, but you also talked about the different means of how you can facilitate the need for tech services, even. Like we talked about, contingent staffing, SOW, independent contractors. There's all these different mechanisms to be able to do that. To me, that's a delineation in itself. Contingent staffing, how do you define contingent staffing versus how do you define SOW, right? And that's something that if I, and I only had the tech services for the first year and a half of when I came into Mastercard. Then
Right.
I got contingent staffing. So I was in this mindset of just thinking SOW, not contingent staffing. But after getting contingent staffing, it still took a couple of years before we truly had the level of delineation of how we think about it. Because now, how we think about it is three things that truly define an SOW. Minimize the hand-holding, be an enabler of problem solving, leveraging your ecosystem, the supplier's ecosystem, and be a future teller. That's what we expect from our suppliers because they have a governance and cadence that happens with the business where our contingent staffing is a vendor blind program.